the Ethiopian church took all of this literature, which included literature that nobody considered scripture at the time, and they appear to have just been non-discretionary and included everything.
For nearly 6 decades, an Ethiopian monk lived in complete isolation on the summit of a towering cliff in northern Ethiopia, protecting an ancient manuscript written in Ge'ez, a language older than most surviving copies of the New Testament. He never preached from its pages. He never revealed its message. He never allowed it to leave the small stone room where he lived. The monks around him believed its mystery would disappear the moment he died. But on the final night of his life, as the candle burned low and his last breaths grew weaker, he finally chose to speak, and according to him, the words he was about to reveal came from Christ himself, words the outside world was never meant to hear. Right where the story feels like it should reveal its greatest truths, there's almost complete silence. If you're fascinated by hidden history, forgotten scriptures, and ancient mysteries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the secrets we're uncovering are only just beginning. The mountain that hid a secret. To understand the manuscript, you first have to understand the climb. High above northern Ethiopia stands the ancient monastery of Debra Damo, resting on the flat top of a massive cliff. There are no roads, no stairs, and no easy path. The only way up is by climbing a long braided leather rope, pulling yourself hand over hand against the rock face. Abba Takla made that climb once in 1965. He never came down again. The mountain became his home for the next 60 years. Inside a small stone cell, he guarded a manuscript written in Ge'ez, the sacred language of Ethiopian Christianity. A language tradition claims was once spoken by angels themselves. The oldest complete Ethiopian Bible, containing every book from Genesis to Revelation, dates back to the 14th century. Now imagine what 60 years of that life truly meant. 6 decades of waking before sunrise. 6 decades without leaving the mountain. 6 decades devoted to protecting a book whose contents he could never explain to anyone who hadn't dedicated their own life to the same isolated existence. He watched fellow monks grow old and pass away without ever discovering what he protected. Scholars climbed the dangerous cliff, searching for answers, only to leave convinced he was simply an elderly monk with nothing remarkable to hide. That was exactly how he wanted it, because the safest secret is the one nobody believes exists, and the manuscript he guarded belonged to a biblical tradition unlike the one most people know. While the Western Bible contains 66 books, the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible preserves 81. Among them is the famous Book of Enoch, the ancient account of the Watchers, the fallen angels who descended upon Mount Hermon and, according to the story, changed human history forever. The West rejected it. Ethiopia preserved it. But the Book of Enoch isn't what keeps Abba Takla awake tonight. Brother Johannes quietly adjusts the brass basin in his hands. Across the room, Deacon Michael still avoids looking at the weathered manuscript resting on the goatskin beside the dying monk. Because the greatest secret isn't the forbidden book everyone already talks about. It's the one lying silently beside him, the one no outsider has ever been allowed to read. For 3 years, Johannes served at Debra Damo without ever seeing Abba Takla open that manuscript in front of another person. Over time, he convinced himself it was simply an ancient relic, valuable only because of its age. Tonight, he realizes how wrong he was. Even now, as death approaches, the old monk's hand keeps returning to the worn vellum, guarding it until his final moments. Then, Johannes understands. The manuscript was never the treasure. It was the lock, and tonight, that lock is finally about to be opened. The missing 40 days, the Mashafa Kidain, or Book of the Covenant, was guarded by Abba Tekla for 60 years because he believed it preserved a lost part of Christ's final teachings. The Gospels mention 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, days that should be among the most important in Christianity. Yet the Gospel of Luke summarizes them in only a few verses. Christ appears, speaks to his disciples, blesses them, and ascends. The Mashafa Kidan tells a different story. It claims Christ returned not to comfort his followers, but to urgently prepare them for what was coming. Instead of offering reassurance, he delivered a final warning. This completely changes the picture of the risen Christ. Rather than a peaceful farewell, the manuscript portrays him as someone who already knew his teachings could one day be distorted and used for purposes he never intended. According to the manuscript, those 40 days were not a farewell, they were a final briefing. According to this manuscript, those 40 days after the resurrection were never meant to be a gentle farewell, they were a final briefing. Its first instruction is unforgettable. Do not build temples from stone, because every stone will one day crumble. Build the temple within your own heart, because only that can endure. The manuscript presents these words not as poetic symbolism, but as a direct warning against the institutions that would eventually rise in Christ's name. It speaks of religious leaders who would use sacred authority to gather influence, wealth, and power. It describes kingdoms carrying the cross into battle while ruling through fear and violence. It echoes images of crusades, inquisitions, and towering monuments built upon the suffering of ordinary people. The message is clear. True followers were never meant to become part of systems built on power, but notice what the warning is really pointing toward. It isn't only about buildings. Stone is simply a metaphor. The real danger is anything that becomes permanent enough to be possessed, inherited, or controlled, anything that survives long after the spirit that created it has faded away while continuing to demand loyalty. The teaching suggests that the moment faith becomes something that can be owned, someone will eventually claim ownership over it. But if faith is built where no hand can seize it, it remains beyond the reach of every empire that tries. Abba Tekla continues speaking in a quiet voice. Johannes leans in, determined not to miss a single word. Before moving forward, the old monk pauses and offers a warning of his own. This, he says, is the gentlest of the three teachings. Then he introduces the next idea, the wind of error. Imagine discovering those words for the very first time, by candlelight, completely alone. Abba Tekla says he was 31 years old when the manuscript first came into his care. Even now, he insists that reading those pages changed something inside him forever, something that never returned to what it had been before. Taking a slow breath, he continues. The second teaching sounds less like traditional theology and more like a diagnosis of the human condition. According to the manuscript, every person carries two unseen forces within, the wind of life and the wind of error. But the wind of error is described as something far deeper than ordinary sin. It behaves like an invisible infection. It enters through greed, selfish ambition, deception, and corrupt desire. Once inside, it slowly hardens a person from within until they no longer recognize what they have become. The manuscript gives these people a haunting name, walking tombs. They continue living ordinary lives. They eat, work, sleep, and repeat the routines of each day. Outwardly, nothing seems different, yet inwardly, something sacred, has already fallen silent. For nearly 2,000 years, that image remained hidden within these mountains. What unsettles Johannes isn't that it sounds like a warning about evil, it's that it sounds painfully familiar. It reminds him not of monsters, but of ordinary people, men and women, who slowly became hollow without ever realizing the exact moment the light inside them disappeared. Here, the soul is not treated like a defendant standing before a judge. Instead, it is portrayed like a body capable of becoming sick without knowing it. And unlike sin, illness doesn't wait to be confessed. It spreads. Then the manuscript reveals what it calls the cure. Not rituals, not ceremonies, not institutions, knowledge, not knowledge gained from others, but direct awareness of truth, an immediate relationship between the individual and the divine with nothing standing in between. It says Christ taught his followers to guard their own minds the way soldiers protect the gates of a city, watching every thought that enters and every thought that leaves. Throughout the evening, Michael has deliberately avoided looking at the manuscript, but now he finally turns toward it. Abba Tekla has stopped speaking. His eyes remain fixed on the next line, yet he refuses to read it aloud. The silence settles over the room like smoke. Then the old monk looks directly at Johannes, as though deciding whether he is ready to hear what comes next. The silence between thoughts. The monks believe this single sentence was more dangerous than anything else contained in the manuscript. They say that if these words had spread freely throughout the Roman Empire, the foundations of institutional religion might have begun to crumble within a single generation. Before we go any deeper, make sure to subscribe, because what Abba Tekla is about to reveal is the passage the monastery guarded more carefully than any other. The candle flickers. Finally, he speaks. The kingdom of heaven exists within you, hidden in the silence between thoughts. Read plainly. Those words remove every intermediary. Imagine the world in which they were first spoken, a world where access to God depended upon priests, temples, offerings, and carefully controlled religious authority, a world where spiritual connection seemed available only through approved channels, a teaching that places the kingdom entirely within the quiet space of a person's own mind doesn't merely challenge that system, it dissolves it. If the kingdom is already within, then nothing remains to be bought, guarded, or monopolized. No institution can stand between a person and the truth they are capable of discovering for themselves. People who experience a direct connection with the divine become remarkably difficult to control. According to Abba Tekla, that is the true reason the Mashafa Kidan vanished from the wider world. Its message did not simply threaten a religious doctrine, it threatened an entire system built upon fear. And perhaps its most remarkable claim is this: it never asks anyone to abandon faith. It simply asks them to discover its deepest center, in the one place no earthly authority can ever reach. The manuscript insists that the kingdom of heaven is not confined to a church, a religious hierarchy, or a sacred ritual performed by the proper authority. Instead, it exists in the brief stillness between one thought and the next, a place equally accessible to a humble farmer and a powerful emperor alike. Remove every institution, the text suggests, and the teaching remains untouched, because it was never dependent on institutions in the first place. That, according to the manuscript, is exactly what made the message so dangerous. Johannes feels the foundations of everything he has believed begin to shift beneath him. Questions rush into his mind, and he starts to speak. But Abba Tekla quietly raises a trembling finger, asking him to wait. There is still one final teaching, the old monk whispers. his voice changes. Until now, he has spoken about the first two teachings as though describing old wounds. But this last one comes out like a confession, something he has carried his entire life and hoped would remain buried forever. The familiar face, Johannes reaches for a cup of water and offers it to him. Abba Tekla gently refuses. His breathing has become shallow, and the candle has burned down until only a tiny orange flame remains. Then, at last, he reveals the monastery's final warning. According to the manuscript, the risen Christ tells his disciples something deeply unsettling. The darkness will come, wearing my face. Not as an obvious enemy, not as a ruthless tyrant, but as a deception disguised so perfectly as holiness that almost no one will recognize it. It will speak in Christ's name. It will display his symbols. It will raise monuments in his honor and repeat his teachings with beautiful words, all while quietly stripping those teachings of their true meaning. That is what makes the warning so disturbing. The enemy described in these pages does not reject Christ. It celebrates him. It does not destroy the cross. It carries the cross at the head of armies. It does not silence the gospel. It recites it inside magnificent cathedrals built upon the labor and suffering of the poor, while draining every dangerous truth from its message. Such a warning is far more unsettling than the story of a simple villain. A villain can be recognized, confronted, and opposed. But what do you do when the deception wears the face of the very thing you trust most? The manuscript forces a painful question. When you look toward the symbol above the altar, is it leading you toward the original teaching, or has it become something standing in front of it? In that moment, Johannes finally understands why these pages were never intended to be read lightly. The third teaching offers no clear enemy to defeat. Instead, it leaves the reader with a question that can never be completely answered. Within these writings, the Antichrist is not portrayed as one future ruler sitting upon a throne. It is described as a system, an institution, a structure that hides behind the image of Christ while quietly betraying his message from within. The monks of Debra Damo never treated those words as a prediction about some distant age. They believed they were witnessing that process already unfolding around them. Abba Tevolde slowly closes his eyes, shielding them from the fading candlelight. He has lived his entire life on this mountain in silence with these passages, convinced that the world had finally reached the moment for which they had been written. Yet, he says, one outsider came remarkably close to uncovering the entire mystery. Ironically, the manuscript survived not because of one dramatic act of censorship, but because of something much quieter, a patient determination to keep it hidden. The monks understood that ideas this powerful did not need to be publicly condemned. They simply had to remain unheard by the wrong person at the wrong time. For nearly 2,000 years, the safest place for these teachings was a locked chamber, high atop an isolated mountain. Then, almost unexpectedly, someone from the outside world came within reach of opening that door. A French scholar. His name was Jacques Mercier, an ethnologist associated with France's Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. In the late 1990s, Ethiopian authorities entrusted him with an extraordinary privilege. They allowed him to study the Garima Gospels, ancient illuminated manuscripts, now believed to date between approximately 330 and 650 AD, making them among the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts anywhere in the world. Imagine the scene. A dimly lit monastery room, the scent of aged parchment mixed with candle smoke. A careful researcher gently lifting pages so ancient they existed long before many of the institutions historians considered foundational. Mercier later spoke of the silence that filled the room, the remarkable weight of the manuscript in his hands, and the slight trembling in his fingers as the realization slowly settled over him. He was no longer simply reading about the earliest Christian world, he was touching it. He had arrived expecting to perform the careful work of a scholar, to examine, date, and authenticate historical documents with scientific objectivity. But the Garama Gospels refused to remain just another research project. Somewhere between opening the cover and turning the first brilliantly illuminated pages, the detached observer disappeared. In his place stood a man who realized he was holding something that challenged the neat historical timeline he had accepted throughout his career. The manuscripts before him appeared older than many of the authorities he had relied upon for decades, and suddenly the history he thought he knew no longer seemed quite as certain. Only a handful of passages from the Mashafa Kidan have ever made their way into Western hands. Yet everyone who encountered even a fragment described the same unsettling feeling Jacques Mercier experienced, a dizzying sense that everything they believed suddenly shifted beneath their feet. Abba Tekla had lived with that feeling since 1965. Mercier, however, had the luxury of closing the manuscript, packing his notes, and returning home. He could step back into a familiar world where nothing seemed to have changed. Abba Tekla never had the chance to walk away. For nearly 60 years, he guarded a secret he believed could never be revealed. Then, with a quiet voice, he told Johannes that the greatest mystery wasn't the Mashafa Kidan. It was what rested beneath the mountain itself. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Ark of the Covenant was never lost. It is said to remain inside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. The Kebra Nagast tells how Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, secretly carried the Ark from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. The Bible describes the Ark as an object of extraordinary power. Some have even speculated that these descriptions resemble an unknown energy source, though no evidence has confirmed that idea. Even more mysterious are the guardians, who, according to tradition, devoted their entire lives to protecting the Ark and often suffered similar illnesses before dying. Abba Tekla believed the Ark and the Mashafa Kidan protected two parts of the same forgotten truth. He then spoke of Lalibela, where 11 churches were carved directly into solid rock. Modern experts still debate how such an enormous project was completed so quickly, while local tradition says angels continued the work each night. To Abba Tekla, the churches reflected the manuscript's message. Only by passing through darkness can one reach the light. Finally, he revealed what he believed was Ethiopia's deepest secret, not stone, but blood. He pointed to the Solomonic dynasty, ancient traditions, and historical connections linking Ethiopia to the biblical world. He even raised the controversial possibility found in some ancient traditions that Jesus survived the crucifixion and sought refuge in Ethiopia, where oral stories still remember a mysterious figure known only as the righteous teacher. One saying he explained captured everything. The West has the water, we have the well. When Johannes asked why these secrets were being shared after 60 years, Abba Tekla answered simply, because the time has come. The Mashafa Kidan describes an age of webs of illusion, a world many compare to today's digital era. The monks believed the manuscript had been preserved for the generation that would finally recognize its message. As the final candle burned low, Abba Tekla placed his hand upon the manuscript. Without another word, he passed its burden to Johannes and Michael. 60 years of silence ended in a single moment. And perhaps, according to this story, Ethiopia's greatest mysteries are only beginning to emerge.